Good morning, everyone, and welcome at Northwest University's Regional History Research Group's research webinar for this year. I'm Emil Coetzee. I will be the coordinator for today's webinar, which means I have the pleasure of introducing the facilitators for every session, and then also to bring our webinar to an end later this afternoon. And therefore, it gives me great pleasure to ask for Dr. Mokgadi Molope to do the welcoming for us. And Dr. Molope is a Deputy Director in the School of Social Science at the Mafeking campus, and over the broader school entrusted with the portfolio, a very important portfolio of community engagement. Dr. Mokgadi Molope is a Senior Lecturer in Development Studies. So, Dr. Molope, if you would be so kind to welcome us officially for this webinar.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Emil Coetzee. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning to all of you. Thank you very much for the opportunity that has been granted to me to welcome all of you present here this morning. It is indeed with a great pleasure to be part of this important webinar, whose theme is engaging community or communities in regional histories, research, sharing experiences, and best practice. Colleagues, while we are required by law as researchers, academics, and institutions of higher learning to engage with communities in an ethical manner, I believe that it is just morally correct for us to do so. Ethical complexities such as participants, diminished autonomy, coercion or monetary inducement, language difficulties, illiteracy, or lack of true understanding of the engagement process are matters that must be at the center of our relationships with our communities. It is therefore not surprising, colleagues, that questions are asked by various stakeholders in relation to community engagement. For example, researchers are asking, how should I engage communities? What is the starting point? What is expected from me as a researcher or a person representing a research unit? At the same time, communities are asking, what should we do if we want to have relationships with a researcher or an academic institution? These questions are pertinent because engagement between the researcher and a community should be beneficial to the two, I believe. As a consequence, the relationship must be guided by integrity, honesty, openness, respect for the self and the other party. Thus, the question, does the traditional historical practice, Bernard, as oral histories and memories inform the quest for a rigorous historical awareness, whilst also complementing sustainable society progress as a 21st century community need remains pertinent. I trust that the presentations we are going to engage with today will share valuable experiences and provide us with guidance in relation to community engagement best practice applicable not only to history, but other disciplines can also learn some lessons from them. This theme is also challenging, ladies and gentlemen, to all the disciplines because they may use lessons learned from here to conduct some introspection in order to determine how beneficial or detrimental are their community engagement efforts. With that being said, I would like to extend my warm welcome to all of you present here and to you, Program Director, Mr. Emil Coetzee, as well as Prof. Elise van Eerden from the Northwest University, Dr. James Hlongwane from the Great Zimbabwe University, Prof. Johan Tempelhof, an extraordinary professor from the NWU School of Social Sciences, Prof. Siki Bakiba Peter Lekwati of the University of Witwatersrand, Dr. Vusi Kumalo from Nelson Mandela University, Professor Verne Nel from Sociology, Northwest University School of Social Sciences, Professor Bizet Jube from the University of Zambia, and ask you to please engage in a meaningful manner, share your experiences with us, and feel very welcome to the Northwest University. I believe that all of us are indeed going to benefit from the proceedings of today. So let us relax and engage with the presenters. Thank you very much.
Dr. Malope, thank you very much for your kind and wise words and for creating the atmosphere which this webinar will be conducted in. And this gives me the opportunity to just relay to everyone that is connected just a few indications on the process of the webinar. I'm sure all of you have received the program, but just shortly we'll have our first session now, where I will introduce the facilitator, who will then conduct the session and then also handle any questions that the audience might have for the presenter when the presenter has finished presenting their work. And this should please be done by writing the question in the chat section. So the facilitators would please need to note any questions that comes through on the chat section at the bottom that can then therefore be relayed to the presenter to answer. I will, of course, also need to monitor the time for every session, but I will directly message the facilitator to indicate when time is coming closely to an end for any wrap up to be done. So our first session will be with under Professor Tempelhof, and then we'll have a second one before we have a little bit of a coffee break at 11:45. And then after the clock has struck noon, we'll have our last two sessions before we bring the webinar to an end. So I think without any further ado, maybe I can just add that I suppose there will be a PowerPoint presentation shared on the screen. I believe it's okay if the presenter opens the device's camera. Please excuse me for not doing so. I have a little bit of problems with my camera on my device. But I hope the picture, as you see it, is still relatively historically accurate on how I look like. So without further ado, let me therefore introduce the facilitator for our first session, which is Professor Johan Tempelhof. And just a little bit of background, Professor Johan Tempelhof is a historian working in a transdisciplinary mode in the field of water studies. Much of his research in the field has a bearing on community engagement in matters of municipal water and sanitation service delivery in the rural areas of the province of Northwest, Gauteng, Mpumalanga, and the Free State. He is author and co-author of 70 accredited journal articles, 11 books, and several contract research projects. His most recent book is South Africa's Water Governance, Hydraulic Mission from 1912 to 2008 in a WEF Nexus context, as was published by Oasis, which is a publishing company situated in Cape Town, and was published in 2018. Professor Johan Tempelhof I also had the pleasure to have Professor Tempelhof as the supervisor for my master's degree dissertation. So I would like, therefore, then to hand over the mic to Professor Tempelhof to introduce our first speaker for the day. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you very much, Emil. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll just flash an image of myself. I'm sitting on the veranda at my home, so it is summer, and I assume that my colleague in Finland is probably somewhere in a much colder area than we are. But it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Ricoletto to you. He is a research director in regional history and cultural heritage at the University of Helsinki Ruralius Institute in Finland. He leads the research group of regions, history, and culture, which focuses on the history and development processes of regions and cultural phenomena in the rural context. He has also authored and co-authored a number of publications. So it's my privilege to introduce my colleague on the other side, Professor Rikelethu, please carry on. Thank you.
Thank you, Johanna. Can you hear me here?
Yes, I can.
Okay, it precisely is quite different weather here up in the north. Today here in Finland, in Seinäjoki, we have 20-something minus degrees, Celsius degrees up here in the north. So we have plenty of snow and a nice frost time here in Finland this time. I need permit to share my screen. Is it okay?
Willem, can you help, please? Willem, are you there?
Okay, I think now it goes.
Ah, excellent.
Okay. This lecture is based on my forthcoming article, Exploring Processes and Experiences, Ethnographic Tools for Experiential Field Research. And in this article, I introduce 3 methodological tools: stimuli-based group discussions, or in other words, elicitation interviews. Second, empathy-based stories, sometimes referred to as the non-active role-playing method, and group walks or group drives with informants, which is a field research method. But in this short speech my interest lies in the first method only, the stimuli-based group discussions, because the other mentioned empathy-based stories and group walks can be understood as extensions of group discussions in different environment only. I hope the slides follow you. I'm not sure. You can indicate if you don't see my slides. Okay, this is a how-to-do lecture. I focus on how I have realized elicitation interviews in my research projects. In the lack of time, it is possible to share my experiences just in brief outlines. But in the article already mentioned, I give more detailed advices how to do with interviews and with data management. Examples have mainly been taken from research projects on home experiences in a rural context, which has been especially developed in Finland at the University of Helsinki Ruralia Institute. Home, if this presentation is understood in its wider meaning as referring to the human need for locality, community, and belonging in culturally and historically refracted ways. Even though the concepts and methodological tools presented in this speech involve research of the experiences of the home in its broader meaning, they can be widely applied in other contexts of human and societal research whenever human experience is explored. A basic weakness of social research is the erosion or even contamination of results because we researchers have preconceptions. We have inherent restrictions. We put questions waiting for certain kinds of answers. The commonly used research tools, such as structured questionnaires and interviews with exact questions, tend to anticipate results, causing fundamental bias in research settings. In social studies, participants are often led by structured questions. Here is an example. Which subject do you enjoy most at school? A typical question of questionnaire. And then we have 3 options. It seems probable to me that the given options math, science, and English will be among the most often mentioned answers in this result, in the result of this inquiry. This is because they are set as the basic alternatives. In actual fact, a question itself is an answer. When a question is formulated, it only allows certain kinds of answers, and more substantive issues may remain totally unasked. Perhaps the informant doesn't enjoy any subject. Perhaps he or she does not go to school. Perhaps he or she likes that perhaps she likes these questions, these subjects, but not in such a form they are available in their school. Perhaps he likes English but doesn't like the teacher, and so on. The problem is how to give your feedback if there is not a suitable question. We can see that there are big problems with structured and exact formulations of questions. They anticipate results. However, not asking leads to no research data at all. And in this vicious cycle, ethnographic research tools can offer some kind of help. Put simply, ethnography is the study through direct observation of people in their natural environment rather than in a laboratory. Using ethnography, the aim is to capture rich data and a deep understanding of cultural and social phenomena which are otherwise difficult to operationalize. If we need information from people's experiences and processes of life in communities, ethnography is highly useful. Traditionally, ethnologists have used methods such as observation, and researchers have even lived among their informants for long periods. Usually, researchers are unable to spend months with informants as they go about their daily routines. Long-term observation is time-consuming. It's laborious, expensive, and somewhat uncertain. It creates an ocean of data, the findings of which may still remain random. Normally, a researcher has a very, very specific research interest, and their funds and time resources are restricted. It is often only possible to meet informants just once for a short period of time. Because of all these restrictions, efficacy strategies are needed to guarantee that research really reaches the purpose of the study. The elicitation interview and stimuli-based group discussion offer one possibility for such a methodological shortcut to guide informants smoothly into the studied subject. In elicitation interview, the researcher makes use of series of stimuli, a series of elicitations, instead of structured questions with exact formulations. In group discussion, the researcher takes the role of host rather than an interviewer, and the interviewee takes the role of an informant. The participants may discuss freely about the elicitations. They may say all they have in mind, whatever feels important. In the article already mentioned, I give detailed hints how to choose the elicitations, how to form the battery of stimuli, how to choose the informants, how to lead the discussion. I also deal with the technical realization. You can read more from the book. In this short presentation, I limit to demonstrate how I have implemented group discussions in reality. Various kinds of stimuli can be used to encourage interviewees to talk about the search topic. Text in any form, pictures, objects, sounds, even scents and tastes may work. Elicitation can use almost anything. A physical object, a textual object such as a word, a sentence of a newspaper article, a visual material such as photos, film, or a graph, instead of pre-structured questions or response options from which to choose. A series of stimuli is presented to the participants, evoking the discussion of the topic in a natural way. The researcher chooses a series of stimuli, usually texts and pictures, and these chosen stimuli represent the phenomenon under study. The informants, in turn, make a new representation of this phenomenon. The stimuli, like pictures and texts, are expected to articulate the phenomenon under examination to make it perceptible in such a way that the interviewees, through interpreting the stimulus text, are empowered to express their experiences and the whole cultural knowledge of the issue being studied. I now provide two examples of how we organized group discussions and used stimuli in two of our projects concerning the sense of home. The first project presented here focused on third age housing experiences in South Ostrobothnia in rural Finland. And the second was accomplished in 2015 in the mining region of the far west round in Merafong, Gauteng, in cooperation with Professor Elis Esvan Eden from Northwest University. At the beginning of each discussion, we gave a briefing on the objectives and background of the event, as well as a presentation of the project as a whole and the structure of the session. We asked for participants' permission to record these sessions, which they confirmed by signing the participant list. In this project of group discussions, the informants were shown the elicitations using a screen presentation. The discussion proceeded with the host showing a stimulus and starting the discussion. The first elicitation was one word, one single word, home, written in capital letters in the middle of a slide. Despite the minimal character of the impulse, it evoked lively discussion and even surprising views during the sessions. The participants emphasized various aspects. The same impulses prompted conversations on a variety of topics in different events. The expectation was that the discussion on the impulse would expand at some point to concern several homes. People talked about their childhood home. The first home they owned, moving houses, etc. Consequently, the first stimulus was followed by two questions, asking the participants to think about which of their homes had been the most important to them and which was the homeliest. The third impulse was about the different dwellings. The participants were shown photographs of an igloo, a duck house, a skyscraper, a futuristic house, and a hut. They were asked to study the picture and to decide which one they felt was the homest and why. They were also asked to give reasons if they felt that they could absolutely not live in some of these dwellings. Fourth, the participants were shown the floor plan of an old Finnish veteran house, which is a popular type of house that was planned originally to meet the needs of the Second World War veterans in Finland. The house model was clearly old-fashioned, and as a two-floor solution, it divided opinions. Deficiencies in the floor plan sparked the conversation. The second floor was left to the participants' imagination as the plan lacked the doors and windows. The impulse also included a map, the aim of which was to inspire the participants to consider the location of the house of home. Next, two pictorial potpourris followed. The first, which was the fifth impulse, led the participants to consider home and hominess with the aid of familiar objects in the Finnish context: a coffee maker, sauna thermometer, board game, painting, woolen socks, coffee set, cleaning equipment, smartphone, and an easy chair with a dog sitting in it. The sixth stimulus offered a variety of living milieus: the interior of an old farmhouse, the staircase of an apartment building, a hotel room, and dormitory accommodation. The seventh stimulus concerned the importance of nature in housing and for the feeling of coziness. The slide showed two pictures side by side, one of which represented the commercial center and the other a dirt road in the countryside. The title was "Should There Be Nature at Home?" Next, we showed two pictorial collages again. First, a collection of services connected with housing: a massage, ready-packed shopping bag, and a cleaner, people eating at a restaurant, snow removal, and blood sugar testing. A pictorial combination of suitcases, a rocking chair, and mailboxes followed this. There were also dancing couples and two small children. The aim of the impulse was to inspire the participants to discuss their present and future lifestyles. Each discussion session lasted about 2 hours, maybe even 2.5 hours. As a result, we obtained a rich data set that described the topic in diverse ways and from various perspectives. All the discussions were recorded and later transcribed for analysis. The written material obtained this way totaled about 130 pages. All the created data, recordings, transcriptions, photographs taken, and the descriptions of discussions were permanently saved for research use. In Home project, Home in Merafong, the idea was mainly to apply and test the ethnographic field research methods in South Africa in multicultural context. The main structure of the data collection was quite similar to the one presented already. 6 group discussions with 5 informants in each were organized. A group of planners from the Merafong Municipal Office, black men from Kuchong Township, 2 groups of pupils, boys and girls from the primary school in Velverdiente, immigrant workers from Carltonville Fire Brigade, and finally a group of adults gathered by the local newspaper, the Carltonville Herald. The discussion was hosted in English, but 2 other language options were offered as well. They were Afrikaans and Tswana. The material was therefore made available in these 3 languages, and the participants were allowed freely to use the best they could. The researcher hosting the discussion, Erik Stoch, could speak all 3 languages fluently. Each group discussion included 3 sections. First, we had the opening that was similar to the Finnish home discussions, with a project briefing, a description of the process, the information of the researchers, and the permission to record participants, and so on and so on. Then followed an elicitation interview showing visuals, words, and questions by means of a laptop computer and a data projector that stimulated discussion on the research topic, hominess and feeling at home in Merafong. First, a series of aerial photographs from Merafong were shown. Fochville, Velverdiente, Vadela, Carltonville, Blybank, Ilansrand, and finally Kuchum, and the big picture of the whole area. The second stimulus was a single word again, home, in capital letters, but without any questions. This time it was written in several languages: home, heimat, ekhaja, legai, kotiseutu, to underline the multiculturalism of South Africa. It was followed by several stimuli in question form. These included: what makes your home a home? If you have to take a picture of something that makes you feel most at home, what would it be? If you could choose anybody who could most bring out the sense of home, who would it be? What has a new resident to do in order to feel at home? We also had visual stimuli. A slide of 4 natural landscapes taken from Finland, presenting a marshland, a forest, a river, and a field with some old barns were shown. Another slide showing a built environment, again from Finland, a peasant house, a church covered by snow, a supermarket, and a gymnastics hall. The slide of cultural environment was gathered from South Africa. It included as many as 6 elements: a group of African dancers, barbecue, a carton of Tlokwe beer, an Eskom high voltage power line, funds at a sports event, and a view of a traditional open-air church. The 4th set of visuals showed the dangers in everyday connections: a tailings dam, a building on fire, and 2 people peeking at a sinkhole. Still, 2 more verbal stimuli were given. Have you noticed such changes that have destroyed important features in your environment? And what factors must not be changed to maintain your sense of home? Third part of the session was written tasks. 2 written tasks were presented. First, important places were requested in terms of what they are, where, and why. Finally, there was a mental imagery task using the method of empathy-based stories. The participants were asked to describe their new home and living environment after an imagined move. a short frame story was given. You have moved to a new house and you either feel or do not feel it is homey. All the applied methods worked in a South African context as well as in Finland. However, one important interesting remark is to be made. We showed a series of photographs of a Finnish landscape to South African informants, 2 slides, as you already saw. We tried to test how they will work. Of course, the participants had no chance of identifying the landscapes. In many cases, they totally misunderstood the content, but this did not misguide them from talking about their home. They did not become quiet or perplexed at all, quite the opposite. The Finnish visuals merely pushed informants to share their own views and memories and made them talk about subjects important to them. They saw impacts of mining and apartheid in these slides. Of course, the photographs had nothing to do with these themes, but the informants wanted to understand these pictures in their familiar, homey connections. They explained every picture in their own experiential environment. This is called pre-narrative explanation. The concept pre-narrative explanation or explication simply means how we fill the missing information with our own understanding to make a complete story. This is how human mind works. We understand reality as coherent narratives. An event or a detail may be irrelevant to some episode, but important for understanding another. The pre-narrative reflective explanation made by the informants was highly fruitful as viewed from a researcher's focus. The South Africans did not identify the Finnish marshland, but the photograph induced vivid discussions about deforestation, the traces of mining in their home territory, and the memories of apartheid in their working life. The pre-narrative explanation therefore really seems to work. It makes people tell something essential in their life. And finally, some summative thoughts on ethnographic tools for experiential fieldwork. What is common for the presented ethnographic method is that they give voice to informants and let them express their experiences freely within the research framework. However, several practical issues have to be taken into consideration when planning and arranging data collection procedures. Elicited discussions, as all ethnographic field research methods, always include some difficulties and risks. No one can guarantee the success of discussion on every occasion and for all the informants. Nevertheless, I have made some 80 group discussion sessions and my experience is highly positive. The immediate feedback from the participants is commonly positive, even enthusiastic. Still, some informants may find it difficult to understand the ultimate goal of the discussion session and the whole research because they only see a narrow part of it. Because of their limited view, they may ask if their output was useful at all, or they may wonder what the researchers were aiming at. In cases like this, concise extra information may be needed immediately after the group discussion. It may be useful to tell the informants that researchers will have much broader view on the subjects when the data collection is complete and data are analyzed. It is also important to mention that the data collection using ethnographic methods is seldom the sole source of information. More conventional methods, such as literature study, will be used to complete the understanding. In addition to methodological challenges concerning how to reach individual experiences in the first place, the challenging question concerns the generalization of results. Can it be claimed that the home, based on individual experiences, also takes collective shapes? Is it possible to abstract from individual memories and landscapes to the level of the collective home without focusing too much on the detail? These problems begin to clear up when various data are brought together. Overarching and distinctive features of home experiences start to appear. A collective experience starts taking shape in manifold personal experiences. People living in the same region recall the same events and describe the same landscapes. This finding is not surprising. People under the same historical and spatial structures obviously share many experiences. It's therefore safe to say that data gathered by using ethnographic tools will give more than just an array of personal experiences. It will provide an opportunity to make interpretations of collective experiences of the home, showing that people living under the same historical and spatial structures really share many experiences. The features that make a place a home to one person quite probably make it a home to others as well. Thank you for listening. My name is Sulevi Riukulehto from the University of Helsinki, and here are my contact details and the references in 2 slides. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ricoletto, for the most informative discussion on methodology. And what struck me about your presentation was the fact that you stressed the principle of observation. And when I think about the ethnography that plays such a crucial role in your research, the most striking example that you are probably very familiar with is Bruno Latour's research in a laboratory where scientists were working, and he just listened to what they were talking about. And they were talking about everything other than the work they were doing. So he made an analysis of that, but it was only by means of collecting qualitative information that he could start individualizing people and the conditions under which they work. And as a philosopher, he really did a groundbreaking work from an ethnographic perspective. And for historians, I think this is a valuable bit of information that you have shared with us, especially the methodology, its very systematic approach, and its ability to capture a unique single events in a very broad context. And you also stressed the difficulty that you experienced in getting to generalizations. Now, what was interesting to me is that What you are dealing with is you are dealing with the concept of the home and the earth. And it is vital to our understanding of concepts of housing and how people's lives can be enriched if and when proper town planning and housing designs are in place. Now, since the 1990s, we've had RDP housing in South Africa. And that was government-sponsored housing free of charge to people, but that stream has dried up to a large extent. And now I see the authorities are more individualistic in their approaches to dealing with housing. So I'm certain that some ethnographic thinking has definitely informed our understanding of what the home represents to maybe a first or a second generation of South African in the Merafong area. Now, also what is interesting to me was your comparison that you drew between Ostrobothnia and Merafong. That's very nice. It's extremes. But where I find some similarities is the fact that you looked at post-World War II housing and how the family perceives the housing. And it's significant because we have many first and maybe second generation South Africans that you engaged with in your research. And it gives us as insiders a very nice impression from outside about how you perceive this and what you picked up, how you picked up the issue of apartheid, which is a universal, but people obviously just understand it, they contextualize it immediately. Also, the whole thing of Ostrobothnia, which is on the left, on the western side of Finland, suggests that your neighbors are the Swedes and you have a very special relationship with it, just as we have a very good relationship with our neighboring countries in South Africa. But it comes down to the township, to Merafong, where people of different societies engage. So what also impressed me was the fact that you took note of contingency. And you know, it's not just a cause and a response. You look deeper at various potential options for universalizing by looking at the individual and going into great detail and taking great care in getting your understanding of what people were saying. And what is also interesting is that you give us an impression, and I'd love to read your empirical study on how the Finnish people experience their domestic interior and their landscape, and also how the South Africans did that. And what is especially of importance, and I've done this in my own research already, is to ask people to give us a ground plan of their house. Where was the tap? Where was the sewage? And it is amazing if you look at it historically, what a divergence you have of ideas that stream in, and you waken a historical consciousness that people can diagrammatize for you in their presentation. So it is also striking to see how the universal application of the idea of a landscape becomes internalized in the case of people living in Merafong. And that just suggests to me, as Ronald in 2011 observed, ethnography concerns itself with the routine ways in which people make sense of the world in everyday life. And here you had a spontaneous group giving immediate responses. And I found that fascinating, and they can relate. It's the human state the condition, the human condition of being. So what you have told us about the methodology, I think should give us a lot of food for thought. And I think we will have a lot of answers and questions from our participants. So therefore, I'm not going to take further note of this, but I would just like to report to people who are interested that the Gauteng Cities Observatory produced a report earlier this year about the whole of Gauteng's residents, how they feel. It was a massive qualitative, quantitative investigation, but primarily it focused on quantitative issues. But where they came out with the most valuable information, as far as I'm concerned as a historian, was the qualitative views that you can only generate by means of ethnographic research. And that is what you have done in an exemplary manner with your sound methodology. Colleagues, can I ask you, does anybody have some questions? I have not seen any questions yet on the chat board.
There's questions on the chat, Johan.
Okay, I have now, I see it. Right now, first of all, Elise says, thank you, Professor Salebi, for sharing your thoughts on an approach towards community that might be less directive from a historian's side. How will you use these observations in a historical narrative in which you balance community voices with written voices?
Okay, I am a historian in the first hand, even though my presentation today handled with ethnographic methods, but I am of the opinion that we historians, we are not only interested in the past tense, we are and we should be and we are interested in the whole temporality of human beings, both the past, present tense, and the future. And in order to obtain the whole temporality in certain space, we need both the traditional history critical methodology, such as books and newspapers and perhaps social science methods such as interviews and questionnaires, but I tried to underline in my presentation that we really have a need for more experiential information as well. And I'd like to add these different kinds of data together. We need critical historical analysis from the sources, but we can also create new sources to use from people's group discussions, certain kind of experiential sources. And also certain important concepts should be underlined. One of them is the experientiality. The other one is historical consciousness. We historians need both of them. We should be more interested in people's historical consciousness and their experientiality. And observation gives a further add for our traditional toolbox. And I think we should make use of it more. With these ethnological methods, we can obtain very rich data. And I just showed you how it works, but even more interesting would be what kind of results we obtained, both in Finland and South Africa. And this we could say a simple data from Marafong. It is just one data from Marafong, but it is so rich that we could study it years and years and find many kinds of things. We could study, for example, people's understanding of their landscape, how the landscape has been changed, how they feel it. We could, for example, study what these informants tell us about their feelings, their bad feelings to the environment, for example. These informants talked very much, very much about their fears, about the dangers. Even if although our theme was home and hominess, they knew we should talk about home and hominess. But the question of home is not just a question of love and positive feelings. The sense of home covers the whole spectrum of emotions, both positive and negative. Not all the things that have happened are positive. There are also fears, there are dangers. This is very important part of our understanding. Okay, I stop here.
Thank you, Professor. Another question came from Kriel. I don't know if it's a lady or a gentleman or a doctor.
It's Lisa Kriel, Prof. Lisa Kriel, Johan.
Oh, Lisa, hello, and thank you for your answer. She said, thank you for a most informative presentation with so many practical hints. This approach goes a long way against the pseudoscientific the pseudoscientification of cultural research of society, which is even creeping into art-related research in the environment I work in. Students somehow increasingly seem compelled to include questionnaires and pie charts to add to the seriousness, in quotes, of their research. The ethnographic elicitation approach is obviously richer. In visual studies, I presume one could also encourage participants to produce visual images themselves, reproduce from their memory, imagination. And then, Prof. Templov just mentioned that. Thank you for raising the problem of generalization. If perhaps you could elaborate a bit more on that.
Okay, there are many parts in this question or comment. Thank you for these points of views. I absolutely agree with you that visual studies could make use of these methods, and it is of course possible that the people themselves make visuals. This goes well. I have not tried it in my research work, but it absolutely is possible. Then you asked about the problem of generalization. I don't have much time for this issue. It is a question of a whole lecture in itself. But I just tried to grab the problem that, or the critique, if someone criticizes ethnographical studies, that you are only operating with one person, two person, or five people, and it is such a small group of people that you cannot really say much about the wholeness. And I tried to show that if people yes, they have their own individual memories and they have their own landscapes they are talking about. But if the people, many people live on the same geographical territory, they probably have their important memories about the same events, and they tell and they describe their visions of landscapes from the same views. There are certain important and decisive events and places in their environment. And this is why it is we can suppose that we are not only dealing with individual events, individual conceptions, but the collective memory of what happened and the collective landscape where we are living can be obtained through these group discussions. One group discussion is not usually enough, because in one discussion there can be some dominating person who has a point of view and all the other informants follow. But if you have, say, five discussions, one after the other, the same elicitations, but different kinds of different groups of people, and they still talk about the same items and they repeat the same kind of stories, they have the same point of views, we can be quite secure that we are dealing with the collective landscape and collective memories.
Okay, the final question, it's Nadine Smith. She had lots of questions to ask you, but our time is limited. I will ask you just to be very brief about it. She points out that she is interested in understanding how people see themselves within an environment. She watched a program recently dealing with the concentration camps from the era of the South African War in 1899 to 1902, and she wondered how people's perceptions of their environment, especially when displaced, can be impacted. Could what they associate with the area impact, and how far this impacts their features or their futures? I'm also thinking of refugees or even people who travel or relocate from work from one job to the next. Right. Can you answer that briefly?
No, very large items again, but if we think about the old wars, like the Anglo-Boer War, in marathon discussions we did not handle with this item, but this actually this event popped up in other group discussions we had in Potchefstroom area, and even though it is more than 100 years ago, what happened, it still is present in people's memories. And yes, this is a method by which we can also obtain information from remote events, and the memories also have forms of no, I missed the word. The memories come over generations to this day. It is possible to obtain also such an old event as a war and concentration camps 120 years ago. And the other question was about the refugees and people who travel, relocate for work, this also is a large question, but I answer this way, that home is not necessarily one place. It is not one place, but many people have multi-located homes. They have homes here and some important places in other places as well, and together they form their multi-located home. This could be seen also in Merafong. We had a group of refugees in our discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ricoletto. Can I just add, perhaps there's one book, if you are interested in Finland and you would like to draw comparisons with our situation in South Africa. It was written by Jared Diamond in 2019. It's called Upheaval: How Nations Cope with Crisis and Change. And there you form an impression that the Finnish people, how they have struggled not only against nature and the elements, but also against the potential invasion of Russia, and how they had to ward off and try and maintain their independence against Sweden. That was a very influential society. And now in the 21st century, the residents of Finland are said to be the happiest people in the whole world, most satisfied with their living conditions. So that says a lot for how they have been able to overcome their crises by probably looking at, in a resilient way, at how to deal with crisis and change. And certainly, I think for us as South Africans, that's maybe that book of Jared Diamond. He compares 6 countries, and Finland is one of the countries, and that should give you a very good idea of how we can perhaps learn from looking at Finland's history and how we can change our circumstances in a current environment where 44% of our economically active people in the country are unemployed. So Professor Ricoletto, I think that is probably where the great value of your research is situated for us, the methodology, and also the potential to look at history and be aware of historical consciousness and how that influences the past, the present, and the future. Thank you, Emil. I hope we didn't go over our time too long.
Thank you for your hints, and thank you also for your nice words.
Fantastic. Thanks. It's very nice communicating with you.
Right. Thank you, Professor Tempelhoff, for facilitating our first session. And therefore, I think let me cross over immediately to the facilitator for the second session, which is Dr. James Hlongwane from the Great Zimbabwe University. And to introduce him, Dr. Hlongwane is a senior lecturer in the Department of History at Great Zimbabwe University. He has published book chapters and articles in referee journals, and his research interests are largely in borderland histories and politics. Dr. Hlongwane, I hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. And as said, my name is James Hlongwane from Great Zimbabwe University. Allow me, colleagues, to introduce Professor Liwati from Witwatersrand University in South Africa. Professor Liwati is a professor of history. He holds the following degrees: BA Education, BA Honors, a master's degree, and a PhD degree in history. Professor Liwati has published several articles and book chapters in refereed journals, and his research interest among other areas, in radio and community histories. Professor Liwatse, kindly take us through your presentation.
Thank you very much and good morning, everyone. And I'm really sorry for missing part of the session. I was struggling with the connection. I hope everybody can hear me. So this morning, I want to present a paper, which is basically extracted from, or rather the presentation itself is extracted from a paper that I published in the Journal of African History some years ago, 2009 to be precise. Can I just get an indication, Dr. Hlongwane, how much time you're giving me for the presentation?
I think, sorry, Emil, you would like to just to respond. I think we should go for what it was intended to. And it will just be less leg stretch and conference breakdown, I guess. Emil, what do you think?
Which is what, 20 minutes, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it's 20 minutes, Prof. Liwatse.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'll then cut to the chase. The paper, the title of the paper, that is the original paper, basically was Colonial Experts, Local Interlocutors, Informants, and the Making of an Archive on the Transvaal Ndebele from 1930 to 1989. And today I have been requested to talk about my experiences. So I'll be talking about how an archive has actually been generated from oral research, the oral research that was conducted in communities by Dr. N.J. van Warmelo, together with his local research assistants in various communities in the Transvaal, that is the old Transvaal, in the Free State, in the Northwest, as well as in Natal and the Cape Colony. But my focus is specifically on an archive or on the Transvaal Ndebele. So let me start off by saying that over a number of decades in the 20th century, Dr. Nicholas J. van Warmelo, who was a chief ethnologist in the Native Affairs Department, responsible for collecting and producing scientific and cultural knowledge on African societies in South Africa for the state. He was working for the state. He collected manuscripts, many manuscripts written by local African intellectuals. Okay, these are local intellectuals, teachers employed in various rural schools who are now actually working, employed by Dr. van Warmelo himself to collect this information, oral information from the communities, from groups, from various communities, from people who are considered knowledgeable about the history of their people. Now, his collection has actually been named the Dr. N.J. van Warmelo Manuscript Collection. Now, some of this knowledge clearly became tainted by apartheid, as van Warmelo's interpretation of the material was used by the Department of Native Affairs to justify the apartheid homeland policy. The reason why the material was actually collected in the first place was, to provide information. It's really about gathering knowledge, scientific and cultural knowledge on the people, about whom very little was actually known by the state. So it's about really getting a sense of who is who and where are they based, so that the government could actually effectively govern over them. So that was the main purpose why Van Warmelo was actually employed to work in the Native Affairs Department's Ethnological Publication section, to produce this information, to produce this knowledge, to gather the information, and so forth. So that is what this presentation is primarily about. I want to say that what was published by Van Warmelo is just the tip of the iceberg, because much of what was written has actually been left languishing in the National Archives. In fact, much of what was written has been left languishing. A lot of this material has not been processed at all. It has not been interpreted. It lies there, and it's a useful resource, which I actually found very, very useful. In my own doctoral studies, I found this to be an extremely useful archive, notwithstanding the fact that it was tainted by apartheid. So one really needs to be very careful about what they read. We know what the purpose was for collecting this information, but nevertheless, there's so much more that this archive contains that is waiting for scholars to basically research and produce knowledge about Africans. In fact, most of this material is actually written in African languages, virtually all of it, I have to say. So I started working on this material as recently as 2000, and I found the original manuscripts and then made use of some of them. My interest was on the making of the Ndebele in South Africa, the so-called Transvaal Ndebele. And I found that there are, in total, there are roughly about 500 volumes. To be more specific, it's about 497 to be exact, of these manuscripts written in African languages by these local researchers, these local intellectuals. And these have been consolidated into about 100 boxes in the archives. I should also point out that they are in the National Archives in Pretoria on Hamilton Street, but a complete replica, an exact replica of this archive can be found at the University of Pretoria. So, so you've got these two fairly similar archives in both at National Archives and the University of Pretoria. And they form a massive, rich, and unique source of indigenous knowledge, and should be made, I want to argue, this should be made available to all South Africans interested in authentic African expressions of the history and culture, cultures of the country's many peoples. So if you could just go back to the previous slide, because I'm now getting to the focus. Here, I'm saying that the focus, the real focus of this paper is on the dialogical relationship between Van Warmelo and his local informants and research assistants in the process of producing knowledge on the Transvaal Ndebele. And secondly, I provide an analysis of Van Warmelo's texts and of his researchers' manuscripts, and look at how an archive on the Ndebele in the country was generated. And finally, I explore the co-production of cultural knowledge, which was as much appropriated by the apartheid state for social engineering, the making of the homelands or Bandustans, as by the Ndebele interlocutors involved in contemporary struggles over chieftainship. What do I mean by this? Clearly, the archives was collected, it was gathered in order to, come up with knowledge on the Ndebele as one of quote unquote tribes in South Africa, as one of the tribes in South Africa, because that was the main aim, to divide Black South Africans into tribes so that you don't find any African who does not belong anywhere. So they all have to be demarcated into tribes. So this was an exercise in the creation, in the making of the tribes. And in the process, of course, this knowledge was co-produced. Van Warmelo could have not done it all alone by himself. He just did not have the human resources to do that. But also the cultural, being a cultural insider is also an aspect that is important when you are collecting knowledge. And so by using local researchers, he could actually get around that problem. But this information continues to be useful today. When people in various communities are engaging in making claims, for example, on issues of land, this is one archive that they go to. And there are resources in there that can actually help assist in locating where the people were located. But most importantly, in terms of chieftainship or traditional leadership struggles that are ongoing, part of the reason why chieftainship struggles are so ongoing is because of the material benefits that goes with being a ruler, a traditional leader. So if you can successfully claim that you are a ruler and be recognized, so it comes with material benefits, and hence, struggles over chieftainship continue to the present day. So this archive is actually used. It was co-produced, and the apartheid state, of course, used it for its own agendas, but the people who were engaged in the production of this material, as well as the people today that are engaged in issues of succession disputes and so forth, go to that archive to make sense of it. So we can move on to the arguments that I'm actually making here. Next slide, please. Now, so as for the arguments that I'm actually making, the first one is that local African interlocutors, that is the informants that were interviewed by these local teachers, as well as Van Warmelo himself, because he also did research. He went to communities and did research. So these local interlocutors powerfully shaped the colonial experts' conceptions of Ndebele identity. So they really influenced his views on Ndebele identity through the information that they provided. And secondly, the co-production of cultural knowledge on the Ndebele, I want to argue, was not an innocent undertaking. It was a highly political enterprise. And that enterprise was about fixing tribes. So there's nothing innocent about it. And I'm making this argument in response to some scholars, and especially anthropologists, such as the late David Hammond-Took, who actually sought to present the Native Affairs Department ethnological publications section as something that really didn't have anything to do with the state. They was just sitting in their corner and doing their job, he argues. They didn't really contribute anything that could have actually influenced state policy. And I'm pushing back against that line of argument to say that that was not innocent, it was a highly political enterprise of creating tribes. Thinking, conceptualizing Africans as tribal people. And finally, marking that Van Warmelo's work was as much appropriated by the apartheid state for social engineering as by Ndebele interlocutors involved in contemporary struggle over chieftainship. So we can move on, and obviously, I don't think I'm going to do justice to this paper, but I'll just touch on different things here. So the next slide is really about locating and mapping the Transvaal Ndebele. Who are the Transvaal Ndebele? Clearly, and there's confusion, it's often confusion in a lot of literature that is produced. There's a notion that these are stragglers, these are leftovers, people that were left behind during the time of the Mfecane, in the early 1800s, when the Mzilikazis, Khumalo people who came to be called the Ndebele were pushed across the Limpopo province into southwestern Zimbabwe. Clearly, the Ndebele that we are looking at, and that came to be labeled in the early 20th century, around the 1920s and 1930s, as the Transvaal Ndebele by Van Warmelo himself, among other scholars. These are early Nguni communities, people who moved from the southeastern coastal regions from the 1500s and 1600s, migrating slowly into the interior, and they ended up settling in various parts of the Transvaal. Now, and hence they are actually called Transvaal Ndebele. So the concept Transvaal Ndebele itself is a new category. It was imposed by Dr. Van Warmelo himself as a label of convenience. And it came to be used in order to avoid confusing the Ndebele in South Africa with the Zimbabwean Ndebele, who only came into existence nearly 200 years ago. And so Van Warmelo, through this material that he collected, was actually able to classify the Transvaal Ndebele into two categories. The Northern Transvaal Ndebele, who are actually found north of the Springbok Flats into the northern parts, what we call Limpopo, and parts of the Northwest Province today, right? Those are the Northern Transvaal Ndebele. And then the Southern Transvaal Ndebele would be those that are actually found south of the Springbok Flats, going into the Eastern Transvaal. Your Gauteng area, also parts of the Northwest Province, but Mpumalanga as well. So these are the classifications that were actually used. And in fact, the Transvaal Ndebele, were officially known, at least until 1994, as either the Northern Transvaal Ndebele or the Southern Transvaal Ndebele. Two categories, two distinct tribes, according to the framework, the classifications that Van Warmelo came up with. But Van Warmelo's understanding of the Ndebele was shaped by the informants, okay? It was shaped by the information supplied by his local researchers. And that is the point that I'm making, that these researchers had their own agendas as well. So if we can quickly move on to the next slide. I think the next slide shows you the map where the Springbok Flats is or are, and where the Northern Ndebele are located and the Southern Ndebele are located. Very quickly, if you could take us through to that slide. Yeah, so this is the location. This is really the location of the Ndebele groups that I've actually looked at. So very, very quickly now, and I'm rushing. So what you have on the next slide is the samples, really, just one sample of these handwritten manuscripts on sections of the Northern Transvaal Ndebele specifically. This one slide, the first slide, was actually written by Jonathan Maraba on the Ndebele of Mashashani area. And in that manuscript, he actually talks about where they originate in terms of their lineage, how they migrated and they ended up settling around the Polokwane area. And the next one, also on the same group, is by Ledwaba. And Ledwaba, who actually comments on the impact of the Mfecane migrations, on the Mfecane, phenomenon of the Mfecane on this particular group of people and their relations with other people in the region. And it talks really, that is the Lidovas manuscripts, talks really about the issue of cultural fluidity, how the Mashashani people came to incorporate other local people, such as the Pedi in the area, the Batlokwa people, as well as some Swazi, who actually joined this group to become, the Mashashani people. Ultimately, this information, of course, when Van Marmelo looked at it, he was not really able to incorporate element of cultural fluidity, because his main task was to come up with a sort of a framework that says, this is a tribe of the Ndebele people, and these are the Northern Ndebele, assuming, sort of imposing the notion of cultural homogeneity of the people, where actually he himself even acknowledges that there's so much fluidity and things are not straight cut, as a tribe being a group of related people who practice a common culture, a common language, and so forth and so forth. So ultimately, that's about all the time that I had. I realized that I've run out of time, so I'll reserve my conclusions, but I think I've also covered those conclusions in this presentation. And I'll stop here, Dr. Hlongwane. Yes, that's the picture of Dr. Van Warmelo himself. And maybe in questions time, I might actually be able to elaborate on who the man really was, where he came from in terms of his biography. Thank you very much.
Lest I forget, let me take this opportunity to thank you, Professor Liwati, for a captivating presentation that you have given. Your discussion resonates well with the old adage that if you want to write about the history of lions, you should not ask the hunter, but you must give the opportunity or a chance to the lions themselves to tell their own story. Precisely, this is what Dr. Wamelo, I'm sorry for the poor pronunciation, Dr. Wamelo did in your discussion. Your presentation rhymes with the call in academic circles that when you are intending to write about local communities, you must write your history from below, where you get to the communities in order to capture their lived experiences. Indeed, you did that. Indeed, Dr. Wamelo did that when he employed local informants and the local researchers to get the information which he wanted. Allow me, Professor Liwati, to summarize your presentation for the benefit of participants. The principal character in your presentation is Dr. Wamelo, who was employed by the South African Native Department, and he was given a daunting task to fix African tribes. And to do so, or rather before doing so, he realized that he was an outsider. So he had to make use of local researchers, and also he collected information from local informants. And in the final analysis, we see a valuable information being collected and labeled Dr. Wamelo's manuscript. The information became valuable in the sense that we see in your presentation, the former South African government and the African tribal groups start bidding for the information. The former South African government made use of the information to implement its homeland policy. Equally, African groups utilize the information in lending legitimacy to their claims on African chieftainships. Right, having summarized your work for the benefit of participants, let me give the chance to fellow colleagues to ask you some questions. Kindly ask questions, colleagues.
Dr. Shlangwana, there are several questions in the chat section. Are you able to see the chats on your device?
Yes.
Would you mind relaying those to the presenter, please?
Right, the first person here, how does one go about interviewing persons with the potential hidden agendas? That would be very useful to know indeed. That's the first person. If you can kindly answer that one, please.
I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much for that question. It's always important to realize, first of all, that when you go into an interview situation and beyond just relying on, Van Warmelo's, collection of indigenous language manuscripts, I have, of course, throughout my years as a historian, relied extensively on conducting oral interviews. And quite often, part of the reason why an informant agrees to an interview is because they've got an interest. And one of the agendas that they have is to tell their own story, obviously. Where there is no interest, I mean, it's almost impossible to get a story from that person. So one always have to be very careful as an oral historian, that that there are agendas, there are reasons why people are actually telling particular stories. And so as you and of course, it's because there are agendas as well, it might be that the informant might exaggerate their story, the importance of their presence or what they are saying in terms of that story. They might exaggerate, they might embellish the story, and sometimes they might even lie. So one always have to be very, very careful. If I could just give, outside of Van Warmelo's work, in terms of another research that I've done on, for instance, the spread of the Soweto uprising in the countryside in the 1970s. I once conducted research in the 1990s, shortly after democracy was achieved in South Africa. And I was asking this young man who, during the course of the interview, I discovered that he was only 10 years old when the Soweto uprising happened in 1976. And he was telling me how, as a high school student, he, in 76, they broke the windows of the school and they were up against, against apartheid as a medium of instruction. But then, and I discovered that, you know, that can't be right. Although I did not confront him, it was only when I was analyzing that I started questioning that. And I realized that actually part of the agenda behind him telling me that story was to show, you know, how much involved he has actually been in politics, okay? So perhaps he was lying about it, but maybe he was not lying. Maybe he was confusing 1976 with the 1980s, because there is actually evidence that in the 1980s, the school that he went to, and especially in 1981, the school that he went to was indeed involved in some kind of uprising, but it was not 76. So those are some of the problems that one actually has to be alert to. That people can mix up things, but quite often it is because of the agendas that they have to present a particular image of themselves that they can actually embellish the story. So one always has to be careful that sometimes people distort the reality. So one always has to have more sources, you know, in order to verify, have a sample of interviews, conduct interview with this particular person, but also have other stories to see if a pattern is actually emerging from these various stories. Yeah. Thank you. Dr. Tlongwane, I think I've responded to that question.
Okay, thank you, Prof.
Yes, I see there's also another question.
Right, are you seeing it there?
I'm seeing a question. What evidence do you have that the informants had hidden agendas? So it's a related question.
Okay, and then I have another. All right, I have another person here,
yes,
which I can read for you. It is interesting that you present this paper when we are about to present a chapter on Bane Simon and on Simon and Dagmore.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm having problem with my.
Excuse me, and Dagmore Booty, Dr.
Okay. If you have any questions, comments for the presenter, feel free to type your. No, it's not like that. Are you seeing the person over there, Professor Wati?
Let me check.
Can I speak, Dr. Khamwane? Would you allow
Yes,
me
you can.
to ask that question?
Okay, you can.
Well, my question
Sorry,
is,
it's cutting. It's not very clear.
I'm saying it's interesting that. Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah, Vusi, I can see the question. Maybe I should just read it out.
Okay.
The question says, it is interesting that you present this paper when we are about to present a chapter on Bani Simon and Dagmore Booty collaboration in the 1960s. This speaks to the complexities of Black and white collaboration in American Historical Association in New Orleans next January.
Sorry, can I correct something? Actually, yes. we are about to present a paper in this American Historical Association.
Okay, okay.
So yeah, there's typo, there's some mistake in typing. So the question is, it's about carry on with the reading, so that because it seems as if the typing is a bit confusing.
Okay. What is the question, Vusi? I mean, I see the comment, but I'm not seeing the question.
Can I just, well, the question is, the question is all about collaboration. How would you actually connect what Joel Caprita is currently working on regarding Bengt Sandler, who wrote a book on the prophets, and published in 1940s while using Regina Twala, and the book never actually even acknowledged the contribution of Utwala. So I wanted you to actually engage and tell us more about those flaws of collaboration in the 1950s and the 60s between Black and collaborators. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, I got it. Vusi. I mean, that's a very good point. And actually, I should say, that is part of the reason why I did this research. And in fact, I continue to do work in this area. To say that quite often these collaborations are very unequal, and quite often, and I think it continues to the present day. I think an example, a good example would be Belinda Bozzoli's work, The Women of Phokeng, which, if you look at the first edition, it does not acknowledge Mantung Kotswe as a co-publisher. And it was because of the pressure actually exerted by the second publisher, who was an American publisher. The name just escapes me now. Heinemann, I think it's Heinemann, who actually insisted, based on the fact that actually Mantung Kotswe did virtually all the work of collecting material, and Belinda Bozzoli simply did the interpreting and the writing of the book, that Mantung Kotswe should actually be acknowledged. But if you look at it historically, I think it was very rare for the white researchers working at the time, like in Van Warmelo's text himself. I mean, the acknowledgement is only in the sort of the acknowledgement section, but not actually in the actual title. Although, I mean, to his defense, there are instances where Van Warmelo really collaborated fairly equally with African researchers. Like there are 5 volumes on vendor law, where Van Warmelo collaborated with a local vendor intellectual, Poppy. And there, they are together. He acknowledges that this Poppy actually co-authored. But in many instances, many anthropologists tended to simply appropriate the information and not acknowledge the researchers. And the key question that I'm looking at here is to say, can we, as we do research, look back to see how this scientific knowledge on Africans was actually produced? Can we ask critical questions about who were the African researchers that did the work? Who were the informants? What are the biographies? What are the biographies of these local Black intellectuals, the school teachers who did the spade work on the ground in terms of conducting information, the interviews, and then transcribing them or interpreting them? And what were their agendas? You see, we have to ask that question about the reasons why they were doing it. For some, like this Jonathan Maraba, who wrote in the early 1940s on the Mashashani, the Ndebele of Mashashani, the Maraba and Ndebele. His agenda, as I read through the handwritten manuscript, was to actually insert himself and his lineage in this to locate themselves, that they are actually the rulers, and how is he related. So in the process of gathering this information for Van Warmelo, which is about who are the Mashashani Ndebele, are they Ndebele, are they not Ndebele, where do they come from? He's actually also putting emphasis on the fact that within this Mashashani people, the rulers are ourselves. And this is how I'm actually related to them. But then, yeah, just to go back to your question, I hope I've actually answered it, Vusi, to say that this is a fraught relationship. It has not been very equal, and it has been debated repeatedly. And it's something that needs to continue because there's so much injustice that was actually done in not acknowledging the contribution that these African researchers have actually done. But it's our responsibility as historians today, also as anthropologists, to ask the critical questions about the biographies of these research assistants, some of whom were actually researchers in their own rights, right? So we need to be able to actually write up the histories of these individuals and to understand what their agendas were in terms of writing, what they were actually writing.
Thank you, Professor Lakwati. Our time has unfortunately expired for the second session. There are still 2 questions in a chat section which we didn't get time for. So Professor Lakwati, if I can ask you, if you'd be so kind to answer them in writing. The one is by Professor Tempelhof, and the other one is by Ms. Janse van Vuren. If you've got time during the course of the webinar, if you can maybe answer in writing Professor Tempelhof's question about if there are any links regarding Ndebele of the Eastern Cape and what chronologies do we have to use to understand their relations with the ethnic Xhosa and Zulu, and then also Mrs. Van Vuren's question about how would one know that Van Wallenmoe's informants had hidden agendas. If I can please be so humble to ask you to answer them in typing and to share it with everyone on the chat section. On the program at the moment, we have a little bit of a leg stretcher and coffee tea break. We should start again at noon, but I think to be fair to everyone, if it's all right, if we start just a few minutes after 12, let's say 3 minutes past 12, and then we can start with the third session if that's in order with everyone. Thank you. Colleagues, welcome back and thank you for all being back here. We can start with the third session, which is going to be, the facilitator will be Dr. Vusi Khumalo, and I have the pleasure to introduce Vusi. He's a senior lecturer at history at the Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. He has published on the politics of knowledge production and economic history. He is the author from Cloud to Entrepreneurship, A History of African Entrepreneurs in Everton, and co-editor of other books in progress and several published articles. Dr. Khumalo is currently finalizing his monograph on the Wilberforce Institute. Vusi, I hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Emil, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome again to this important academic session. I will be facilitating this session, and I would like to introduce Professor Werner Nel, who is an associate professor at the University of Northwest. Professor Nel is a sociologist and a subject chair of the Department of Sociology at Northwest. Specializes with psychosocial articles on the social well-being in relation to religion, spirituality, and natural environment. Welcome, Prof, and over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I really appreciate that. I just like, yes, thank you. Can I just check, Emil, can you maybe just confirm whether my sound is clear?
I hear you loud and clear.
Perfect, thank you very much. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. Okay. All right, can you see my screen?
It's visible, yes.
Okay, let me just start the slideshow. All right. Great, thank you. And thank you for this opportunity to present here. So as is indicated on the original program, my title has been changed a little bit. I decided to focus it a little bit on the COVID situation. So what I'm going to try to do today is to not be too academic, but rather be practical. So as researchers, we need to go into the field, and it's difficult enough to do research as it is, but the COVID situation has introduced a number of additional challenges. So the aim of my presentation today is going to be to share experiences related to challenges and best practices that are associated with conducting field research, especially in COVID times. Now, I have to make a disclaimer, I'm not a historian, so it would be arrogant of me to tell historians how to do research, and that's the last thing that I'm trying to do. It's merely sharing a few experiences in the field as predominantly as a social science researcher, with a hope that it may be of use to anybody doing field research, especially the kind of research that involves human participants and so on. And there are also a number of pragmatic and institutional changes that we need to be aware of. And it's very easy for research trips to get ruined these days. We've learned some hard lessons in the field. I've been in a number of communities in the last year or so during COVID times. I've got a number of PhD students who are doing their field work now. I've had to go through ethics applications for this and learned a few lessons the hard way, which I'd like to share, again, in the hope that it would be of use to anybody else planning to do field work in this situation. So I've broken it down into a number of points that just thematically summarizes the typical issues that are likely to be faced by people doing field research now. So one of the first things is that we have increased risk. So when we do any kind of study, of course, we need an ethics application. And one of the key things that an ethics committee looks at is the risk benefit ratio. So they will say, okay, well, your study has certain risks, legal, emotional, mental, physical, financial harm could come from this study in this way or that. And there are certain benefits for the university or the community of scholars in a given field, and also potentially for the participants, and they want a favorable ratio before they approve it. So now, of course, with COVID, seeing that the risk of contracting COVID is there both for the participant and the researcher, the risk-benefit ratio has changed. So this has resulted in a number of changes which are mandatory and which all of us will have to do if we do any research that involves human beings. So first of all, the ethics committees have made standardized adjustments to their field research requirements. This is reflected in informed consent documents, that you now need to have a slightly different set of documentation. There's extra paperwork, and these things will all be checked up by the ethics committee. So it's things that there's no way around it. We have to adhere to this also to ensure safety. So it's also then important to address COVID-19 whenever you write a research proposal, and especially when you write your ethics application. It's good practice now to have an extra section just where you acknowledge that, we're living in COVID times, there are these risks associated with it, and then you indicate what steps you will take to deal with that. And generally, if these things are not included in the ethics review, the ethics committees will send them back and request you to do so. So here, it's a bit of a text-in slide, but I've just copied and pasted the additional section that one of the ethics committees, in this case, the Human Health Research Ethics Committee, has added to their standard ethics documentation. So all your participants, in order for your informed consent to be regarded as complete and valid, will have to sign this particular form. It looks slightly different in different ethics committees. So this is one example. But as you can see here, you, in addition to signing the general informed consent and anything, for example, sharing data or that kind of thing, they have to indicate that they agree to participate in the interview and that they consent to a number of measures. So these include that their temperature must be checked, that the actual measurement needs to be indicated. The person needs to consent to using a 3-ply mask, and both using it and wearing it. I don't know why they doubled it up like this. And then they need to consent to sanitation, both of themselves and the venue, with a sanitizer with an 80% alcohol content. So this is a number of implications. So first of all, just filling in that form and explaining that and whatever adds an extra 4 or 5 minutes of time that you need to take to explain everything and do it. And then implementing these things also has a number of implications. So let's have a look at some of the implications, which we can consider as challenges as well, but there are things that we need to deal with. So based on this additional requirements, you're going to have to sanitize both the venue and hand sanitation. So many people just think, okay, well, we'll just take sanitizer and sanitize everybody's hands. But what the ethics document requires is for you to sanitize a venue. Now, you do that 2 or 3 times, and then you realize it is a big problem, because as I'm overlapping to the next slide now, but you'll see it takes a lot of time to do that. And there are solutions to that, which we'll get into in a minute. But if we go by the letter of the law, the implication is the entire venue needs to be rendered safe and sanitized, and so do hands. And then again, all the sanitizing equipment are supposed to be provided by the researcher. So this and the other equipment has cost implications. So it's important when you budget for your research that you include these items that we are going to be discussing in your budget, because it can add up quite a bit depending on how many interviews you're doing. Then, of course, you need to do temperature checking. And for that, you need to purchase a digital thermometer. Now, they're not cheap, so it is quite an expense. So sometimes people have the funds available and they can get one. I've seen that a few of the research units now start to have some of these equipment available that you can loan, but it's important just to find out about the situation and make sure that you do have one, because the ethics committee at some point will ask you to submit your signed informed consent forms for for review and for checking up purposes. And then they will look at that and see, have you done the temperature checks? Have you written in the temperatures of everybody and that kind of thing? And then, of course, by the fact that you have to provide 3-ply face masks mean that you have to purchase them. So purchasing packs in bulk is a good idea. They're often, discounted, and it's not too much of an expense. And we found that it's also, it makes for a very nice thing to give people. Often if you go into rural communities, it's an expense to buy a mask. So we've often given people a mask and an extra mask. And it's a small little thank you that isn't big enough to constitute any kind of biasing level gift, but it's a nice gesture. So, but again, these will have to be purchased in advance. And then, of course, during interviews and things, you have to wear masks. Now, this sounds like an obvious, trivial thing, but there are implications of that, which we'll go into just now. Then also, there's a need to maintain social distancing, which again seems obvious, but in terms of research, it's got a number of implications. And then you need to also do your interviews in ventilated and safe interviewing spaces. So while that seems logical, there are a few practical things which you discover very quickly. So your voice recorder, so if you're doing an interview which you are recording, your voice recorders become much less effective because of the social distancing and the muffling effect. So normally, for example, you might sit around the table with someone indoors, there are no outside sounds, your recorder is in the middle between you, say, half a meter or something away from each person, it picks up clearly and loudly. Now, if you put your recorder close to the participant, it often doesn't pick up the question clearly. And if you put it close to you as the researcher and you hold it, you often can't hear the participant. And this is magnified by the effect that both parties are wearing masks. And then if you move to outside venues, have a ventilated venue, then very often there are wind sounds and things that are blocking it. Now, this sounds trivial, but if you come back, your only record of your data is your recording. And if your recording is inaudible and you cannot make sense of it and transcribe it, it's as good as if you do not have any data. So this becomes a problem. So typically, what you can do is make sure, especially that you move your recording device closer to the participant and rather just voice your questions very clearly and, more loudly than you normally would. Increase the sensitivity levels of your recording device if it has adjustable sensitivity levels, but don't go too high because then you start getting distortion. And then try to find a quiet venue, even if it's outdoors. A simple thing like sitting in a corner of a building outside of the wind helps a lot, because wind can destroy a recording very, very quickly. And then, of course, as I noted, voice your questions clearly and loudly. So what I also recommend is to have a test run with your recorder before. See how far it works away from the person. See how much effect masks have in it, and so on, so that you know what to expect. Because it can really, we've had 1 or 2 interviews being ruined like this, which, I mean, it was so inaudible or so hard to make sense of it that we had to go and redo the interviews. And then things like pens, of course, participants need to sign. You need to sign. So it's a very easy thing to forget about, that you may not have enough sanitized pens. So having 3 or 4 pens that are sanitized that you can hand out for people to sign, then collect them back and then re-sanitize them. We found that helps as well, because if lots of people have to sign and one person signs, you sanitize the pen, you give it to the next person, it ends up taking a long period of time, especially if you are doing group interviews. But if you have multiple pens, it speeds it up. So little things, but it makes a difference, because, all of these things together may shorten the amount of time that you're taking for your interview by 20 minutes, which means you can do more interviews in a day. So a few more implications are that it's very, very time consuming to sanitize an entire venue. And you lose research productivity, because it means that you can, instead of say, do 6 interviews a day or 5 interviews a day, you now do 3. So something that we've found is that many venues exist in communities that are already COVID compliant. So many government offices, tribal offices, if you go into centers such as tourist centers or whatever, typically they already have the infrastructure in place. And in that case, you don't need to go through the whole process because the venue has already been rendered compliant. Often they also have the necessary tools to take people's temperatures, sanitizers, all of those things are there. So definitely that is a fast route. I would say that once we've decided to go this route in a previous field trip, about roughly 2/3 of all our interviews we could do in existing venues that were COVID compliant, and it really helped our productivity in the field. And then another thing that you can do if you don't find a venue like this is to use a suitable outdoor area. It's also safer because it's better ventilated, but then just find an area that is outside of the wind, which, as I've noted earlier, can interfere with the recording. And also, don't schedule your interviews back to back in the same time frame that you are used to before, because they do take longer. Because very often what happens is, in addition to all your own things that you have in place, there are other things. So, for example, when we went to the schools, we visited probably about 20 different schools in a community that we went to for different interviews. Then at the gate, there's a whole process where you have to fill in form, contact tracing, you get scanned, the whole thing. Then you get in, and then when you get into the building that you want to be, this process gets repeated. And then you have to do your extended informed consent and all the other things. And very often the interviews took at least half an hour longer just because of all these preliminaries. So be sure to enable or allow extra time in your schedule, especially if you have multiple interviews. All right, so then we move to another limitation and challenge, which is that there's more limited availability of gatekeepers, participants, archives, and all of these things. Now, be very careful here. Sometimes, because what happened to us in a few cases, we had to visit someone in the State Department for an interview. We phoned in advance and we were told this particular office is operational, they're working, everything is fine. So we went there, and then when we got there, it was all closed. And they said, no, they are operational, but the people are working from home. So it was a completely wasted trip. And even though on everything from the website to people that we spoke to, confirming that this thing is operational, the venue issue became a big problem. So make sure when you are visiting people and, places are open, whether the individual will actually be available and, at the office, or whether they are working remotely. And then another issue that we also see is that there's often reduced willingness on the part of people to participate due to fear. And of course, especially when working, say, with more elderly participants and so on, where the risk, in terms of COVID is especially high. I mean, this is really understandable, and this can be an issue for some participants. So we haven't had too many, but we've had about 2 or 3 people that we approached for interviews in a recent field trip who just said, no, they're not comfortable doing it now. Now, sometimes you can arrange for an alternative, like a Zoom session or some other online method. But of course, if you're working in very rural, remote communities, often this infrastructure isn't available. But there can be ways around this. And then for anybody doing research that involves people in the medical profession and associated professions, it is extremely hard to get hold of these people. So one of my PhD students working in Lesotho in clinics and things, and we've been struggling for months to get participants. So we'll get maybe 1 a week that would be willing and able to speak, because they're all overwhelmed with, hospitals being full. Many of them are, completely fatigued from having worked double shifts and things because of staff shortages and so on. So we find that is particularly hard to get hold of right now. So if you do need to speak to people like that, it may be best to be realistic in your expectations of how many people you will find. And then archives, which I think, is particularly relevant for historians, are often closed during high lockdown levels. So it's important to find out if you plan to do a field trip, and that includes visiting archives, to verify whether the archive will be open. And then, there are some further caveats associated with that, which we will be looking at in later slides. So Another situation that is particularly, that characterizes the whole pandemic is something we refer to as VUCA in the social and other sciences. Now, VUCA is an acronym standing for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And times were described like that already pre-COVID, but now it's exceptionally so. So we're dealing with a situation that is unpredictable, that can change rapidly, where often there's a lot of gray areas. And this can affect us as researchers in a number of ways. So one of them is in terms of the availability of and access to data sources, which can be participants, can be archives, can be institutions, because you may plan your trip in 3 months, but you don't know in 3 months whether the lockdown level is going to change, whether there's a new variant, whether there's a state of emergency, whether, what the situation is. So it makes it very uncertain. Your ability to access participants may also be associated with this, because maybe, there's some kind of a lockdown or a ban on people visiting the institution and so on. So all of that plays a role. And then the ability to secure accommodation near data collection sites is also a problem. So you may think that, no, I will agree with the people to meet them, personally in their private capacity somewhere at a place that's open or some neutral, publicly accessible area. But you may need to spend several days in the field, and you may not be able to access accommodation because in certain lockdown levels, all of that is closed. And we're going to look at solutions to that just now. And then there's another problem, which is that internal policies of various institutions and organizations and so on can affect your access to data sources. And these are not necessarily aligned with prevailing lockdown levels. So you may think you're in lockdown level 1, so that the general kind of rule set would apply to the company or the group or the organization that you're trying to visit, but sometimes this is not the case. And you find out that they have, they've had an outbreak of COVID in the office, and they are basically functioning like what would be a level 3 lockdown situation, even though the country may be in level 1 and so on. So all of these things now mean that because of this volatility and uncertainty, we need to do a lot more homework in advance. We need to do advanced homework, and we need to do long-term planning. Long-term planning is riskier, so we need to make our planning more short-term. So typically, we may often plan research trips long in advance, but now in COVID times, it makes much more sense to have a concept plan in place, speak to people, find things out, but put your actual plan in place very, very kind of close to the actual time that you're going to be going into the field, so that you have the necessary access and so on. You can read where things are going to some extent by watching the COVID figures and so on, and then based on that you can time it. But we need to be more careful with that. Long-term plans now are very risky, and they maybe have cost implications, because there may be costs that you cannot retrieve if you've booked things and they're not available. And then also inquire about the institutional COVID-19 policies related to everything from archives to organizations. And so prior to your field work, to make sure that people are they available? And if they're available, are they available at the office or in another place, and so on, so that your planning can take that into account. All right, so I'm mindful of time, so I'm not going to expand on this too much. There's 1 or 2 other points I'm going to make, but I'll press on to my last slide, which is more of we can call it a sociological, psychological phenomenon, which is that major events like pandemics become like filters, and unfortunately they can become distorting filters for people. So when you look at people's answers to questions and interviews, you can take many perspectives, but one of them is to see them as narratives. And if from the context of narrative psychology and all of that, we see that recall of the past. So when you tell a story about what happened, it is heavily influenced or colored by present conditions. So we often take the present as a point of reference. So if someone asks you, how was the past, and whether the past was the good old days or the bad old days is in reference to how things are now. In the same way, you kind of mentally plot a trajectory in terms of from the present back and vice versa, depending on the question and the situation. And we cannot keep the present out of the past. And humans work by means of contrast. So if you say something is hot, it's relative to something that's cooler. If you say something that's bright, it's relative to something that's darker. And the problem comes in that the pandemic has been such a distorting filter for people in terms of their life circumstances, their economic circumstances, their prospects for the future, relationships, their general mood, their subjective well-being, that all of these things now become filters that will affect what they tell you. So what we know from research is that if you ask a person something about the past or their lives, and you ask them it now, and you ask them that same question about a past event prior to the pandemic, chances are that at least in some cases, you're going to get different answers. So we had a big problem in the social sciences around 2010. Many people invested lots of money in social well-being initiatives to increase subjective well-being in communities. And then they would start with a pre-test to see how happy are the people in these communities. And then they do some intervention. And then they do a post-test to see, well, what's the difference? And the problem was that in 2010, especially just before the Soccer World Cup, everybody's well-being just went through the roof. It was the highest that was ever recorded in South African history since the time that this was recorded. And it was this artificial effect from the World Cup, and it ruined many experiments because it worked like a halo, where everybody saw the country, the future, everything through these rose-colored glasses, which of course were temporarily, were infused, something that was generated by the media, but still it had a very real effect. So all our scales were distorted. The typical correlations and things that we saw between subjective well-being and other things fell flat. So the pandemic may have that kind of effect, and it's important to keep that in mind. It's far harder to combat than some of the other issues, but by being aware of it and by using probing questions, like when people say something is bad or good, and asking them why do you say so? Can you give me a specific example? In what ways was it bad or was it good? So that you anchor any value evaluations in factual information rather than relying on more subjective interpretation. So there's more we can go into, but again, I'm mindful of time. So I just wanted to flag this issue and think it's particularly relevant in historical context where often people are asked about things from the past. So there are more challenges associated with the COVID situation, but these, in a nutshell, are some of the larger ones. And again, I'm offering them from a social science, sociological perspective, just with the hope that, maybe for those planning sessions in the field, that there could be something of value there. So thank you very much. That's my story.
Thank you very much, Prof. Prof, this is very interesting. Being a scholar that specializes in well-being, Prof. Ned decided to give us a very interesting presentation. By the COVID-19. So I feel that I need not to take much time responding to Prof, because I think that this is a very important session for us to share our experiences, because we've been out of the field different. I've been doing a project with Northwest where one visits Taung, and we had various challenges. We would want to go to the archive, and you find that in the archive, the time is kind of reduced from the normal time. And sometimes you want to interview elders who are very important when it comes to a historical research. And these elders, mind you, they might die anytime. and you get delayed. So even here at my university in Port Elizabeth, students have been experiencing serious challenges when it comes to field work. So I feel that we should actually open it for discussion, questions, because it touches on all of us, and we would like to hear experiences of other scholars who are in this virtual room. I'm now opening up, and thank you very much, Prof. Your specialty in well-being is commendable, because you touch on very important ethical issues that have been impacted by COVID-19 when it comes to field.
Great, thank you very much. And I see we already have a few questions in the chat, so maybe I can respond to them quickly.
Yes, you are welcome, Prof.
All right, so I see Anna-Marie's asked whether I could say a few more things about the 2010. Yes?
Sorry, can I just ask you to unshare your slideshow so that we can see you?
Okay, better?
Yes, thank you.
All right, so she was Anna-Marie asked if I could say a few more words about the 2010 World Cup. So if you look at well-being research or happiness studies and so on, where people's subjective well-being, so that is the extent to which they're satisfied with their life as a whole, you know, it's often asked to people on a yearly basis, so you can plot the graph in terms of how happiness goes. So we see that in 2010, before the 2010 World Cup, it spiked and it reached the highest level in South Africa's history, because there was a lot of hype in the media about, you know, this World Cup and how wonderful it's going to be, and because soccer is such a passion in the nation, and also because of all the ideas that it's going to bring in money and, you know, this kind of thing. So it artificially created a situation where people's satisfaction with their entire lives was boosted, even though it was only this temporary thing. And the problem was now researchers that, for example, wanted to test how happy are people in a given community and so on. That same community was, you know, far less happy the previous year than this year, but there's no logical reason for it, because the very same situations in their community prevailed, but suddenly these indicators started to go all wobbly. And the reason was this background societal thing that affected people's mood and affected people's outlook, and also via constructs such as hope. So we know that one of the things that is associated with high subjective well-being is higher hope. So the moment that there's a pathway that people can see to a better life, whether that is going to happen or not doesn't matter. If they think it's going to be like that, we see that subjective well-being goes up. So probably via this mechanism of hope that is brought here, subjective well-being went up through the roof, and then it started distorting everything, because instead of measuring what people's genuine situational well-being, what they would have said without this distorting filter, we now saw a distorted thing, and we got results that were really, really funny and crazy and so on, where people in living literally without running water and in terrible conditions were temporarily happier than people, you know, with incomes in the hundreds of thousands of rands living, you know, spectacular lives. So it really distorted things, and it created a lot of drama in terms of research. So yeah, and I think the same thing is applicable now in reverse. The pandemic, I think, has brought a very negative cast of mind for many people, having lost jobs, relatives, fearing the disease, and so on. So the possibility of romanticizing the past or selectively storing the past in a different way in order to get coherence with the narrative of what's going on now, all of these things are risks. Exactly how it would manifest in a given study will be up, you know, to the researcher in question to figure out, but I think just being aware of this possibility may help. All right, so that was that one question. The next one was from Prof. Van Eden, said, should historians shy away from doing community engagement research? I think definitely not. I think it's just that it's part of the territory now that there are more things to take into account. And I think it's just doing it and just planning a bit more carefully. And of course, I think you can also plan your trip in such a way that if you plan it closer to the time, you find out whether people will be available, you have multiple data sources, so there are different people you want to speak to, you want to go to an archive, whatever. Even if there's a problem with one or two of these things, then maybe you can still do the other things. And you can maybe arrange to get some of the remaining data via a different method or something. So I definitely don't think it should stop us from doing research, because I think the need for research is more now, if anything, because of the situation. So yeah, again, it's just a matter of doing it carefully. All right. I see there's another comment. Let me just read quickly.
Professor Nel, thank you. Our time for session 3 unfortunately has expired. I beg
No
your pardon
problem.
for that.
Thank you.
And therefore, I would like to go into our last session immediately for the sake of time. And here I would like to introduce Professor Bizek Jube from the University of Zambia, who is a professor of history and also served as Dean of Student Affairs from 96 to 97, and as well as a former Dean of School of the Humanities and Social Sciences from 2002 to 2007 at the University of Zambia. Professor Phiri has published extensively in peer-reviewed journals. Professor Phiri, I hand over to you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I'll be chairing this session where Professor Elise Sonja van Eren will be making her presentation. Let me just say a few words with regard to Professor Eren. She's a professor of history at the Van Beek Park campus of Northwest University in South Africa. And she's also Deputy Director of the School of Social Science. She has authored and co-authored more than 80 peer-reviewed indexed articles, and solo authored and edited, as well as co-contributed in 30 book publications. As a local or regional historian, Professor is currently involved in several regional and other multidisciplinary research projects aimed at community engagement and contributing to establishing sustainable societies. She was chairperson of the South African Society for History Teaching between 2009 and 2017. And she is also a board member of the International Society for Historical Dialectics. She served, sorry about that. I was saying she served in a number of institutions, and also she's also a member of a number of index journals, the South African Journal of Cultural History. She is currently still the editor of the National DHET Index Journal and the New Conry Journal. So she's a well-established and very, very experienced academician and historian. I now hand over to her to make her presentation. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Bizek. I really appreciate that. Let me just share my screen and also stop my video, or rather, yeah, okay, let us see. Colleagues, I will try to be fast, although that kind of promise I'm always failing in. My title, as you can see, just to refresh you, it's the first part having to do with community engagement, studies and history, and then also the second part of conflicting moments. Now, in both, of course, in a little short 15 to 20 minutes. It's really not always that accomplishing, but let me try to at least tease you through certain developments, etc., and how I've experienced it, and some suggestions that I have to make in this regard. First of all, to show you quite busy slide on things in the last, or say in the last 2 decades, some developments from the educational and academic community, of course, on community engagement, in which historians can really tap into quite excessively. Of course, if you look at them, you will see, for example, left-hand bottom, the public history, companion to public history, which already insinuates that when we think of community engagement, we obviously think maybe a little bit close by to where we are as institutions. I find the 18 rules of community engagement left top quite informative, and then some others that you might care to also review at some stage, but they all suggest not only always a solo effort forward, but also a collaborative effort forward. And sometimes it might be thematic. See, for example, the one right-hand bottom. And so I say the voice of community and acknowledging the voice of community has indeed become very loud and louder. And so we as historians cannot really be dormant on this in the way in which we always do it. I don't say we are going to throw out everything, or I don't suggest that at all, but we have to be a little bit more alerted to the fact that we must return to the community in a different way. I think I've missed now something. Sorry, this there you go. All right. So in South Africa, of course, we all know that where we are and where we might not be, maybe, that our higher education and training institution since 1997 really encouraged that we not should only do research in community, but that particular research should also serve in our outcomes, our module outcomes, in the lecture manuals, and also have some possibility of hands-on utility. So the thing is, the big question then might be how to view the positioning of so-called traditional history in this visionary space. Was it done, and was it done in the past? Of course, if I say that, we still need to really do quite a lot of research to really bring on board what can we learn from some scholarly work in the past. For me, I want to point out today the analysis historians. What they thought of traditional, of course, was that it was mainly political and institutional as they viewed it in their time. And of course, we today will perhaps see traditional might be linked to the methodology, different kinds of or changed methodologies of how we do history. But in Anala's time, they worked excessively with communities. But now the question is, have they engaged with communities as it is requested or looked out for in the 21st century? And of course, in what you have heard so far today, for example, about history and community, and in the case of Prof. Sulibi, the using of ethnography as a method, mostly in microspaces, and how all social scientists in collaborative ways with sociology and waves of environmental studies in particular might feature, might also remind you of this much elaborated analysis historical method by 1968. You see the quote there that they basically focused on community to according to them, and I've highlighted for the sake of time, the search was for structure of collective mentality. Their search, of course, the analyst historians' search, not necessarily telling us that, they in different ways engaged with community as we would like to think of it maybe today. Another quote coming also from about, reflecting on the analysis is that they focused on village communities, village structures. And if you read the quote further, you will see it's things that you are familiar with, what kinds of sources that they use locally, etc. But then it comes to the last part where they also indicate linguistics, social anthropology, and a host of other social sciences could also be utilized. So it already insinuates in the analysis paradigm a collaborative approach that had been suggested. But now you also see, while I think about the analysis and what they might have already put on the table as a baseline for us to try and understand community engagement in the 21st century, we also now physically see what the world and what Africa and what South Africa shows us with regards to sustainable development goals. And I've highlighted a few in purple for quickness so that you can see that all of them are examples where history arguably can be well positioned. But I will not talk further about that. So I really believe that history should also view community engagement as not only, for some other disciplines, because it has some particular features. We can look at it now. I think it's really good to think together about its practice, and I really deliberately point out with and within community. I'll come back to that. If I look at past developments on community engagement, just selective, globally and also locally, I showed to you a scenario in Argentina where the organization CLAIS, and if you can read closely, you will see what it is in Latin, in Argentinian. I can't pronounce that very well. Where they started this organization already in 2002. And what's interesting from this organization was it that a historian, Professor Nieves Tapia, was involved. So she also really traveled the world, worldwide to kind of market this kind of way forward. I link it to the first bullet, the politically associated nature of community engagement. Is that might be the reason why we shy away from it, because there's too much linkage to justice, activism kind of activities and selective forms of research, which makes it very difficult for historians, being so robust and may I say erudite-like to really engage with it. For example, just quickly, the CLAIS contribution was that it was associated and linked to the government. So government funded that, and higher education and training institutions had to really be involved in the development of educational social engagement projects. It had a socialistic political framework still, of course, and they work under this paradigm and banner. If you think of South Africa, if you look at the bottom part of my slide, and then I really jump in general, I say we also, in a way, experienced a kind of activism and justice way of looking at the academia from the 1970s onwards, you will remember well. So we have similar like histories, but it came from academia. And Miller, as you can see, there is actually a pro in community engagement research in South Africa. He says there that this pretext in reality was not bearing fruit as far as it comes from an academic point of view, because of a shortage of qualified people to create vigorous educational knowledge. To quickly jump, so second last slide under the disciplines. Here you see another option, Pan-African action research, which more or less will be identifiable in various research formats. This way forward has become pivotal in giving more consideration to the distinctive needs of local spaces on the African continent, and in the process contribute more to Africanized knowledge systems able to serve Africa. So that is one that one also need to take note of. Then, of course, the collaborative participatory, we also link to it other vocabulary, transdisciplinary and multidisciplinary ventures. And of course, we can distinguish all of them. Somebody mentioned it before, the collaborative necessity. And I, stumbled on the Japanese Mazizukuri and community engagement approach, and I could not help to think of Prof. Sulibi's way of doing it. Not that it's nearly the same, but considering how to engage community. So while the Mazizukuri model emphasized community design and development, the Finnish model accentuated community experience of home towards initiatives of design and development. But I think, looking closer, it might be very, very intriguing to see in what way we can be open towards such a model. If you look at the last aspect of last slide on historians elsewhere and community engagement, these specific universities that I reflect here, all of them in the United States, did some recent contributions, or has made some recent contributions towards community engagement in particular, and not just moving in and out of research. So here, for example, you see Amherst in the United States, quite a big university, where they declared they are committed to community engagement through public events, education programs, online classes, engaged scholarships, and community-based history projects. One, of course, would like to know a little bit more on that, but they declared that the history department. And then lower down, you see a very first community engagement article that I know of, where Professor Barry Goldenberg wrote about how to use in practice, how historians can be in practice, be more community engagement alerted with youth historians. He views his dissemination as an experimental contribution towards collaboration with the intention of sparking dialogue on how to combine the traditions of history with hands-on community involvement by students for the purposes, of course, of rethinking traditional processes. I can carry on about that, but let me go to the very last scholarly work that I stumbled on that particularly relates to historians, and that is of Pam Hagbert-Dean and also Walter Ray, where they say finding history where it lives. And of course, Pam Hagbert is an archivist, and Walter Ray is a political archivist. And they reported on processes at their university where they look at specific special collections in the Special Collections Research Center that collected local history since 1956. But they say now they focus more on some diversity of race, economic status, gender and sexuality, religion and politics in Southern Illinois. And they say they are more directed to be more proactive in community engagement beyond the town and gown way of doing, and also to diversify the local collection. And I think we in South Africa really fall short if it comes to that. I'm not sure what my time is, but let me just see, let me quickly check, and so I will have to be fast because this is now really the practical side of it, as how I see it, colleagues. If I look at history and its practice with and within community, I don't want to dwindle too much and too long about or on the conceptual thing of what is with and what is within. I think we all have a little bit of common sense to understand what will be with, together with, and in conjunction with. The circle in the middle shows you that all of this may play a role at the same time. You might be busy with teaching and learning, and then research also comes into play at the same time. So what you see, what I say there is, okay, so if we engage with research alongside community and together with community, that will have to be defined in a very specific way. If we think of teaching and learning, I at the moment feel that the lecturer should lead the student community engagement experience here. For example, based on a module or a module theme in practical ways through a project with community, such as an oral history gathering project. We have a need, for example, now here in Vanderbijl Park area, where it came from community that they really need this. And then if we think of the third leg of HET, engage with community, I think of long and short-term projects where it should service opportunities really for researchers and also our postgraduate students. On the right-hand side, when it's, kind of in community, within community, it means, you just go in and out. And in many ways, when we do provide or develop a kind of a task for our students, it might be something where you, through informed theoretical research within the classroom situation, you consciously develop and execute one practical assignment per module where student may hand-on benefit to better understand the experience and narrate the debate in writing. And I feel really, colleagues, it will surely be with less plagiarism. They need to be creative. And then they also add, some more value to what they understand from the theory you gave. The engage with community is something different. It's something totally different. At the moment, when I look at other disciplines, I see mostly sometimes they want to do something in the community. Now, okay, this is our section there to do something in the community. And I give some examples with our knowledge to assist communities as part of this project of long-term planning left to share, knowledge sharing, clean up, renovating of heritage spaces, encourage preservation of sources of all kinds. And that is what they did in the United States. Help establish community archive. We simply don't do that. This is more elaborative, but because of time, I'm going to skip it, just to give you some idea that it seems to be the best to do it close by. When we think of research there, we again say we need to develop great creative ideas, because then practically it will assist students to better observe, research and record history. And when it's really solely with community, we can complement all the legs of what higher education and training wants us to do and to see. So they ask for engaged research, to get engaged communities, and then eventually in the teaching and learning to create engaged teaching and learning. Now, time doesn't permit me to go through all of this, so I want to get to my last slide on sharing moments of conflict and collaboration within the research. And all I can say there, at the visuals and also the text and also the map to show you where I am. We had a collaborative experience, project experience, multidisciplines in the Far West Rand North National Research funded project to determine the eco-health and well-being status of mining communities. And in this project, of course, many disciplines developed research questions. We had two similar research questions, whether we can work together and what did we then eventually learn from the eco-health and well-being status from our disciplines perspective. But in the case of my experience, I've experienced that I need to learn that one cannot go in and just, like maybe the analyst did, just go and collect the information, find it in the archives, etc. Because when we had the community formally engaged to report firstly to them our research, and then secondly, Lekgotla with them, as you can see on the right-hand side, top in different groups, what did they hear and what do they see might be missing, etc. They immediately criticized the historical part. They could not believe that the mines, for example, contributed financially to their development, or that local government received funding to eventually establish this and that. So they contested that. And I realized that when we do community engagement in a new way, or in a refreshed way, especially collaboratively, then I need to go to the community first. I need to ask them first. And in this way, I say in the right-hand bottom, the sociologist really, well, I say, taught me a lesson. And this cannot be done. So we need to also think about that. And also what I've learned that within this environment, that history should also be alerted to the fact that certain topical issues related to local government, housing, employment and services, you name it, must be cautiously approached. Because otherwise it can breed conflict within community if not correctly managed. Colleagues, my very last slide, I want to say, and I mentioned there now some projects where we feel as Northwest University Regional History Focus Group in the focus area social transformation, that we have, let us say, stumbled on that community engagement opportunity to do research with community, and we're looking forward to really see how that unfold. COVID inclusive, and my last grayish part, communities are also, and indeed the historian's business, and employing the possibilities of public history while revisiting the analysis paradigm might be a refreshing way forward. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you very much for that wonderful and exciting presentation. I was able to pick a few things. Particularly, I think I'll be very brief. In terms of historians, I think for a long time, from what I picked from the presentation and also the paper that you forwarded to me earlier, was that for historians, for a number of times, we tended to feel or to think that as we are doing our research in communities, the communities were not part of what we were doing. But it is very evident from your presentation that if we are going to be of value, not just as historians, but even to the communities in which the studies are done, the researches are done, the communities themselves must be embraced and must feel that they are part of the people that are contributing to the histories that are being written. This is to me, a very important aspect of what is coming out of the paper. A number of examples that you have given illustrate that aspect in terms of how to embrace the community as scholars we are studying. But also another thing that struck my attention was the fact that we are at a stage in the 21st century where history has to embrace other disciplines as well in order to be expansive as well as to be collaborative with other disciplines, rather than looking at other disciplines completely as outside what history is. So I think these are some of the things that are what I've picked, and I hope that as those that are historians like myself who are attending, who have followed the presentation, will be able to embrace as we do our researches for our future contribution to historical knowledge. Also, it also builds on the use of indigenous knowledge systems that people have, because that is where now we are going to build what I can term, for lack of a better term, a wholesome history. So maybe I can leave it at this stage and ask colleagues to ask questions for those that have questions. I note that there are quite a number of comments and questions that have already been shown on the chat. I hope you are able to read them.
Prof, I think, yes, I'm not sure whether there are questions, but I think while if there's somebody to want to ask a question, I want to just catch up on what you've said with indigenous knowledge systems. If anybody cares to read the publication that will come out, in fact, Prof. Sulby, before end of December, the one that you have showed earlier, coming from South African Initiative, you will see that we actually, in a way, in one of the chapters, and one of the colleagues wrote that, indicate that indigenous knowledge systems also, as historians, we should not have a very narrow view about indigenous knowledge systems. It's all inclusive with all the societies. I can go into a society in Japan, or in, say, in Africa, or into a white society in Namibia. All of them, if they had been in a particular place for very long, do have a certain build-up knowledge system, which we need to acknowledge and appreciate. But I just add to that, you know, it's very interesting, but I think we should really get ourselves to become acquainted and to get out of that box and really explore community with all its challenges, and see how we can approach that. Of course, I'm very cautious of, and the students will know me very well, about collective memory. And in a way, we need to, when we deal with collective memory, we always must also be cautious of what we receive, as Prof. Lekwati indicated, doesn't matter from who it comes, and also Prof. Sulby. But enough said, Prof. Bizek, I think people are tired. So yes, okay, Prof. Lisa. You say some thoughts perhaps on ways to present the results of such projects in innovative, affordable ways, and perhaps Prof. Kriel, just to clear a bit, give more clarity. Which results are you talking about?
I was talking about what.
Yeah, I think Prof. Kriel can perhaps just,
yes.
she's on.
Okay, yes.
But you are muted.
They are muted themselves.
Okay, maybe left hand bottom, Prof. Kriel, you will see your mute and unmute. But maybe while you struggle, I look at Nadine's question. Yes, also the impact of social media and collective memory, indeed, Nadine, indeed. But of course, we are hopefully scholarly informed and trained to be able to do that. It's just that we should really not shy away from community. Community is looking upon us to really engage with them. We had this opportunity in the 1960s, 1970s, 80s in South Africa, just to lose it again, and now it's picking up. Prof. Kriel, you are on.
Yes, thank you so much. Sorry, Prof. Piri, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Okay, no, that's fine.
Thank you, thank you. No, Elise, I was actually just thinking about the fascinating ways in which I see how history is missed and necessary in the School of the Arts where I'm working, and where there is such a vast potential, I think, for what students do in art projects and design projects, and how just a little bit of collaboration with historians can also benefit their projects. But suppose you have done the research and you write your article. I'm always just curious, what then happens with this information? How do you keep it in the community?
I think I know what you are getting at. There is a kind of a let me say I'm not going to say perception, it's really reality, that collaborative research seems to be difficult to publish, in collaborative context. But I think you must identify your journals well. There are, and Johan will be the first one to say, Lisa, transdisciplinary journal, use it. And then, of course, there are several journals overseas. We've been very blessed to have some publications from the ZNRF project within journals internationally. So it is possible, and I think as it picks up, in future, there will be more leniency towards that. Of course, I always say to myself, Elise, if you develop the article, it must be a solid historical article. The other things coming with it, the collaborative information and so forth, should be secondary, so that colleagues reading it can see that. So if that is what you actually ask, is that what you ask?
Well, your answer is incredibly helpful. I think it is then perhaps also a matter of people having to play towards their strengths. So if there is collaboration with the historian, then it can be the task of the information designers to take what the historians have accomplished and find ways of distributing that to the community itself in digestible and presentable and visual ways. No, that was very helpful. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, no, thanks. I want to add to that is that, for example, recently we had a meeting with people in the Vaal Triangle area, community itself coming to the table and say, listen, we would like to establish a history community, and we want you to come on board, you people, you historians. And we can't say, I immediately realized that, but we can't say no, because I'm a historian and I must always publish these highly wonderful, well-sourced articles. And I'm really so excited to see that happening in society. So, and they said themselves, and then you can do research in our community, and you can, in our own Indaba or our own Lekgotla, you can present that. Your students can present, and that is exactly what we will try to do, and see how it works out. Okay, but I think Emile is going to stop me now, and so Nadine, you have already responded to your question, and I can only nod and I say thank you very much also for adding on to that email. And Prof. Bizek, I'm done. I think for the sake of time. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you, most welcome.
Thank you, Professor Piri and Professor Van Eden. And I'm not going to speak for a long time. I think we have had a very full program, a very stimulating program, lots of things to ponder and think about. And therefore, I would like to start with the basic indication of gratitude. Gratitude to Professor Van Eden for organizing this webinar. Gratitude to the Northwest University's Social Transformation Research, a niche group that made it also possible. Then also gratitude that I want to say thank you to all the facilitators, Professor Tempelhof, Dr. Shlongwana, Dr. Kumalu, and Professor Jube for being willing and doing such a superb job in handling our sessions for today. It made my job as a coordinator so much easier. I almost feel that I didn't do any work today at all. So thank you for helping me carrying the burden there. Then to all of our speakers, Professor Yakoletu, Professor Legwati, Professor Nel, and Professor Van Eden, for being willing and available to share your insight, for sharing all of your information with us that will assist us in thinking further and pondering about everything that you have indicated to us, what worked in practice, what works in the hypothetical sphere, and for us to become better researchers and better historians as we do so. So I don't think, Professor Van Eden, I should now go into any summary of all the papers. Our facilitators did a magnificent job of that. But I think then just to indicate that for me as vice chairman of the vice chairperson, I beg your pardon, of the Northwest University's regional research group that we have established quite recently at the university, this webinar was for me one of the high points of the year, and I'm looking forward to be part of it again next year. And therefore, obviously, as soon as we have all of our arrangements in order for next year, for all that is present here to know that, of course, you've got an open invitation to join us again in 2022 for that. So, Professor Van Eden, if you're happy, if I can bring this all to an end in this way, I'll be much obliged.
Yes, thank you very much, Emil, and thank you, everybody. I'm quite sure you are now exhausted, and we see each other again. Thank you so much, Emil. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.